May 19, 1941, 11:47 p.m., Tokyo, Japan. Richard Sorge sat at a wooden desk in his apartment on Nagasaki Street, surrounded by the smell of cigarette smoke, stale sake, and the particular chemical odor of the ink he used for encoding messages that would travel halfway around the world. His fingers moved across a sheet of thin paper, transcribing information into a cipher that Soviet intelligence had provided years earlier, a system of number groups that transformed German military secrets into strings of digits that meant nothing to anyone who intercepted them and everything to the men in Moscow who would decode them. Sorge was 45 years old. He had been born in Baku to a German father and Russian mother, had fought for Germany in the First World War, had been wounded 3 times, had converted to communism in the chaos that followed defeat. He had become a Soviet agent in the 1920s, had built a cover identity as a Nazi journalist so convincing that he drank with German diplomats who trusted him with information they would have died rather than share with Moscow. For 8 years, he had operated in Tokyo as the correspondent for the Frankfurter Zeitung, cultivating sources in the German embassy and the Japanese government, transmitting intelligence that his handlers in the Soviet Union considered among the most valuable they received from any agent anywhere in the world. The message he was encoding tonight would be the most important of his career. He had obtained it from Eugen Ott, the German ambassador to Japan, who considered Sorge a friend and confidant, a fellow German patriot whose journalistic credentials provided cover for conversations that would have been inappropriate with an official intelligence officer. Ott had shared what Berlin had told him in confidence. Germany would invade the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. The date was fixed, the preparations were complete. The largest military operation in human history would begin in 34 days. Sorge finished encoding the message shortly after midnight. His radio operator, Max Clausen, would transmit it to Vladivostok the following day, from where it would travel to Moscow through channels that Sorge had never been permitted to know in detail. The information would reach the desk of men whose names he had never learned, men who would read his warning and decide what to do with it. Sorge understood that his role was collection, not analysis. He gathered secrets. Others determined their significance. He lit another cigarette and stared at the encoded text, at the number groups that contained a truth so explosive that its implications had kept him awake for 3 consecutive nights. The Soviet Union was about to be attacked by an army of over 3 million men, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The attack would come without warning, without declaration of war, without any of the diplomatic pretenses that nations traditionally observed before attempting to destroy each other. Stalin would have 34 days to prepare defensive positions, mobilize reserves, disperse aircraft, stockpile ammunition in forward depots. 34 days was not enough time to stop the invasion, but it was enough time to blunt its impact, to ensure that the initial blow did not become a knockout punch. Sorge did not know that his message would be of over 80 warnings that reached Moscow in the weeks before the invasion. He did not know that Soviet military intelligence had already received reports from agents in Berlin, from border guards who observed German reconnaissance flights daily, from deserters who crossed the frontier with information about unit deployments and attack schedules. He did not know that every one of these warnings would be ignored, dismissed, or suppressed by men who understood that telling Stalin what he did not want to hear was a form of suicide that produced no martyrs, only corpses in unmarked graves. The intelligence network that Sorge had spent a decade building, the risks he had taken, the cover identity he had maintained through years of deception, all of it would prove worthless in the weeks ahead, not because his information was wrong, because it was right. and rightness was precisely the problem. Stalin had decided Germany would not attack. Evidence to the contrary was not intelligence to be analyzed, but provocation to be rejected. Sorge's message would travel 4,000 miles to reach a man who had already determined what he believed. The machinery that would process Sorge's warning had been designed not to produce accurate intelligence, but to produce safe intelligence. The distinction was crucial, and it had been carved into Soviet military institutions through 4 years of systematic terror that had eliminated anyone capable of independent judgment or inclined to deliver unwelcome truths. Understanding why Stalin's intelligence services failed to warn him required understanding what had happened to those services before the war began. Filipp Ivanovich Golikov reported for duty as head of the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, on July 26, 1940. He was 40 years old, the son of peasants from a village in the Ural Mountains who had risen through the Red Army by demonstrating the combination of competence and political reliability that advancement required. He had commanded divisions, had served on military councils, had navigated the bureaucratic complexities of an institution where professional ability meant nothing without ideological correctness. His office in the GRU headquarters on Kropotkin Street smelled of floor polish, cigarette smoke, and the particular mustiness of filing cabinets that contained secrets worth killing to protect. The man Golikov replaced had been arrested 6 months earlier. The man before that had been shot. The man before that had been shot. Golikov could trace the chain of his predecessors backward through half a dozen names, each one a cautionary tale about what happened to intelligence chiefs who displeased the men they served. Jan Berzin, who had built the GRU into one of the world's most effective intelligence organizations, had been executed in 1938. Semyon Uritsky, who had succeeded him, had been executed in 1938. Army Commissar Second Rank Semyon Gendin had lasted 8 months before his arrest in 1938. The pattern was not subtle. The message required no decoder. The Great Purge that had swept through the Soviet military between 1937 and 1939 had killed approximately 11,000 officers, including 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and 50 of 57 corps commanders. The intelligence services had suffered disproportionately because their work required contact with foreign nations, and contact with foreign nations invited accusations of espionage, conspiracy, and treason. An intelligence officer who cultivated sources in Germany could be accused of working for Germany. An intelligence officer who reported German military capabilities could be accused of spreading defeatist propaganda. An intelligence officer who delivered accurate assessments that contradicted official optimism could be accused of sabotage. Golikov had survived the purges by understanding rules that were never written but always enforced. He had denounced colleagues when denunciation was required. He had endorsed policies he knew to be foolish when endorsement was expected. He had learned to read the political winds with a sensitivity that exceeded his ability to read intelligence reports, because misreading the winds meant death, and misreading reports meant only operational failure. The skills that had kept him alive were precisely the skills that would make him worthless as an intelligence chief. The filing cabinets in his office contained reports from agents across Europe, documents that described German military preparations with accuracy that would later seem almost clairvoyant. Golikov read these reports with the eye of a survivor rather than an analyst. The question he asked was not whether the information was true, but whether reporting it as true would align with what Stalin already believed. If Stalin believed that Germany would not attack, then reports predicting attack were not intelligence. They were provocation, disinformation, the work of enemies seeking to drag the Soviet Union into a war it was not prepared to fight. Golikov developed a system for annotating intelligence that reflected these priorities. Reports suggesting imminent German attack were marked as coming from sources of doubtful reliability. Reports suggesting German deception or delay were marked as credible. The annotations determined which reports reached Stalin's desk and how they were framed when they arrived. A warning that might have prompted defensive preparations instead became evidence that hostile powers were attempting to manipulate Soviet policy. The truth was filtered through a membrane of fear until it emerged as something Stalin could accept. The men who had built Soviet intelligence into a formidable instrument were dead. The men who remained understood that accuracy was less important than acceptability. Golikov would process over 80 warnings of German attack in the weeks ahead. He would ensure that not one of them reached Stalin in a form that demanded action. The warnings began in January and did not stop. They came from agents in Berlin who had cultivated sources in the German military. They came from diplomats in neutral capitals who heard rumors at cocktail parties and passed them along through official channels. They came from border guards who watched German officers survey Soviet positions through binoculars and reported what they observed to commanders who forwarded the reports to Moscow. They came from deserters who crossed the frontier with information so specific that dismissing it required active effort. By June, Golikov's office had received over 80 separate warnings that Germany was preparing to attack. The paper accumulated in folders that smelled of ink and bureaucratic caution, each report annotated in handwriting that transformed intelligence into uncertainty. March 1, 1941. A report arrived from Starshina, a Soviet agent in the German Air Ministry whose real name was Haro Schultz-Boysen. He provided details of Luftwaffe deployments to airfields in occupied Poland, information that could only mean preparations for operations against targets to the east. Golikov read the report and wrote in the margin that the source was known to exaggerate and that the information required verification from independent channels. The independent channels would provide the same information. It would require the same verification. March 20th. Winston Churchill authorized British intelligence to share warnings with Moscow derived from ultra-decrypts of German military communications. The British could not reveal their source without compromising the secret that they had broken German codes, so they attributed the intelligence to a well-placed agent in the German High Command. The warnings were specific. German forces were massing for an attack scheduled for the middle of June. Golikov annotated this report with particular skepticism. British motives were obvious. They wanted to embroil the Soviet Union in a war with Germany to relieve pressure on their own beleaguered island. The information might be accurate, the purpose was certainly manipulation. April 10th. Sorge transmitted from Tokyo with troop strength estimates that German sources in the embassy had shared with him. 150 divisions were being concentrated along the Soviet border. The number was too large for defensive purposes, too specifically positioned for any objective other than invasion. Golikov filed the report alongside the others. Sorge was a valuable agent, but his information contradicted the fundamental assumption that Stalin had established. Germany would not attack while Britain remained undefeated. Information contradicting this assumption was by definition suspect. The deserters presented a particular problem because their information could not be attributed to hostile intelligence services seeking to provoke conflict. German soldiers who crossed the Soviet frontier did so at risk of their lives, motivated by conscience or communism or simple unwillingness to participate in what they knew was coming. They arrived at border posts with details that interrogators recorded and forwarded to Moscow. Unit identifications, assembly areas, attack dates, operational objectives. A corporal who deserted on April 28 reported that his unit had been briefed to expect operations against the Soviet Union within 8 weeks. A private who crossed on May 15 provided the name of his division's objective, Minsk. Golikov processed these reports with annotations that questioned the deserters' reliability. Perhaps they were plants sent deliberately to spread disinformation. Perhaps they were mentally unstable, their information the product of rumor rather than briefing. Perhaps they had misunderstood what their officers had told them. Each explanation was possible. Together, they formed a pattern of denial that required more effort to maintain than simple acceptance of what the evidence showed. The Soviet border guards who reported German reconnaissance flights did so through military channels that eventually reached Golikov's desk. German aircraft crossed into Soviet airspace daily, photographing installations, mapping defensive positions, noting the locations of airfields where Soviet planes sat in neat rows that would make perfect targets. The flights were violations of Soviet sovereignty that any other nation would have protested or intercepted. Stalin had forbidden both responses. Protesting would acknowledge that Germany might have hostile intentions. Intercepting would risk the provocation that Stalin believed British intelligence was trying to engineer. Golikov understood what the flights meant. He understood what the deserters meant. He understood what Sorge's reports and the British warnings and the accumulating evidence meant. He also understood what acknowledging that meaning would cost him. The truth was not worth dying for. The truth was not even worth risking discomfort for. He continued annotating reports with the skepticism that survival required. Stalin's refusal to believe the warnings was not irrational. This was the cruelest element of the catastrophe that followed. The man who ignored over 80 reports of imminent invasion did so for reasons that made sense within the framework he had constructed, a framework built from strategic logic, historical precedent, and assumptions about his adversary that were entirely reasonable and completely wrong. The strategic logic began with geography. Germany, in the spring of 1941, was fighting a war against Britain that showed no signs of resolution. The Royal Air Force had defeated the Luftwaffe over English skies the summer before. The Royal Navy controlled the seas that separated the British Isles from occupied Europe. German submarines were sinking merchant ships in the Atlantic, but Britain was not starving. German bombs were falling on British cities, but Britain was not surrendering. The war in the West remained unfinished, and every military strategist since Frederick the Great had warned against fighting on two fronts simultaneously. Stalin had studied German military history. He understood that the catastrophe of 1918 had resulted from exhaustion on multiple fronts, from resources divided between enemies who could not be defeated individually when they had to be fought collectively. Hitler, whatever his other failings, was not stupid. He would not repeat the mistake that had destroyed the Kaiser's empire. He would finish with Britain before turning east. The logic was sound. The logic was also wrong, because Hitler did not think like Frederick the Great. Hitler thought like Hitler, and Hitler had decided that destroying the Soviet Union would cause Britain to surrender by eliminating the last potential ally on the European continent.
Kuznetsov set down the newspaper and stared at the wall of his office, at the maps that showed Soviet naval dispositions across the Baltic, the Black Sea, the Northern Fleet's Arctic bases. His ships were not at war readiness. His crews were following peacetime schedules that assumed weeks of warning before any conflict. His ammunition was stored in depots rather than loaded in magazines. His aircraft were parked at coastal airfields in formations that maximized ground space and minimized survivability. Everything was wrong. He could not make it right. The TASS communiqué was not merely a statement of diplomatic position. It was an order that bound every Soviet commander to inaction. A general who dispersed his aircraft after reading the communiqué would be contradicting official policy. An admiral who ordered his ships to battle stations would be suggesting that the government's public assurances were lies. The consequences for such suggestions were well documented in the fates of officers who had questioned policy during the purge years. Careers ended, lives ended. Families disappeared into a system that acknowledged no errors and tolerated no dissent. Along the western frontier, commanders who had requested permission to implement defensive measures received responses shaped by the TASS communiqué's logic. General Mikhail Kirpinos, commanding the Kiev Special Military District, had asked Moscow for authorization to occupy prepared defensive positions along his sector of the border. The request was denied. Occupation would signal aggressive intent. General Dmitry Pavlov, commanding the Western Special Military District, had asked permission to disperse his aircraft from forward airfields where they presented concentrated targets. The request was denied. Dispersal would suggest that the TASS assurances were false.
The aircraft remained parked wingtip to wingtip at bases whose locations German reconnaissance flights had photographed repeatedly over the preceding months. Ammunition remained in central depots rather than distributed to forward units. Troops remained in peacetime barracks rather than defensive positions. Bridges that should have been prepared for demolition remained untouched. Communication lines that should have been protected remained vulnerable. Everything that military doctrine required for defensive readiness was forbidden by political doctrine that prioritized the appearance of peace over the preparation for war. Kuznetsov understood the trap. He commanded the Soviet Navy, which meant he commanded nothing without authorization from the Defense Commissariat and the Politburo, and ultimately from Stalin himself. He could not order his fleets to combat readiness on his own authority. He could not distribute ammunition or disperse aircraft or position ships for defensive operations without permission that the TASS communiqué made impossible to request. He was responsible for protecting Soviet naval power. He was forbidden from taking the steps that protection required. June 21, 1941, 9 p.m., Moscow, the Kremlin. The office where Stalin convened his military commanders smelled of pipe tobacco, leather furniture, and the particular tension that accumulated when powerful men gathered to discuss matters they could not control. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, the defense commissar, sat with documents in his lap that contained the latest border reports. General Georgy Zhukov, chief of the General Staff, carried maps showing German dispositions that had been updated within the past 12 hours. Kuznetsov had been summoned from the Navy Commissariat with orders to attend, but not, he understood implicitly, to speak unless addressed. The report that had prompted the meeting had arrived that afternoon from the border. A German soldier named Alfred Liskow, a communist sympathizer serving in the 222nd Infantry Regiment, had crossed into Soviet territory near Vladimir Volynski and surrendered to a patrol whose initial instinct was to shoot him as a provocation agent. Liskow had been taken to headquarters, interrogated by officers who found his story too alarming to dismiss and too dangerous to fully credit. He claimed that his unit had received orders to attack at 4 a.m. on June 22nd. He claimed that the entire German army was positioned for an invasion that would begin in fewer than 8 hours. He claimed that he had deserted because he could not participate in an unprovoked assault against a nation whose ideology he shared. Liskow was not the only source. Other deserters had crossed at other points along the frontier with similar information. German reconnaissance flights had increased to the point where Soviet air defense commanders could track them continuously across the border regions. Intelligence from Sorge in Tokyo, from agents in Berlin, from every station that the GRU maintained in Europe, converged on the same conclusion: invasion was imminent. The evidence would have been overwhelming to any analyst not constrained by the necessity of telling Stalin what he wanted to hear. Stalin listened to the reports with an expression that witnesses later described as skeptical, annoyed, and faintly contemptuous. He asked questions that suggested he was looking for reasons to discount the information rather than reasons to act on it. Could the deserters be plants sent deliberately to provoke Soviet mobilization, which Germany could then cite as justification for defensive war? Could the troop concentrations be a negotiating tactic, military pressure intended to extract economic concessions? Could the British be behind the rumors, manipulating events to drag the Soviet Union into a conflict that served London's interests rather than Moscow's? Timoshenko and Zhukov argued for immediate mobilization. They proposed ordering border districts to full combat readiness, dispersing aircraft, occupying defensive positions, alerting reserves for possible deployment. The measures would take hours to implement. If the deserters were correct, the measures might save tens of thousands of lives. If the deserters were wrong, the measures could be quietly reversed with no harm done. The logic was military logic, the logic of men who understood that preparation cost little and unpreparedness cost everything. Stalin rejected the proposal. Full mobilization would be provocative, It would give Hitler the excuse he might be seeking for an attack he had not yet decided to launch. A partial alert might be acceptable, something that could be characterized as a training exercise if questions arose, something that preserved the ambiguity that Stalin believed was protecting the Soviet Union from war. He authorized a directive that would later be known as Directive Number 1, a document so hedged with caution that commanders who received it could not determine what actions they were actually permitted to take. Kuznetsov left the Kremlin shortly before midnight. The summer sky over Moscow held the pale luminescence of the white nights, a twilight that never quite became darkness at this latitude and season. He returned to the Navy Commissariat through streets that were quiet with the ordinary peace of a Saturday night, past buildings whose inhabitants were sleeping or celebrating the start of the weekend, unaware that the world they knew was hours from destruction. His office was dark. His telephone was silent. The directive that would arrive from the Defense Commissariat would be too weak to save his ships, too ambiguous to justify the actions that survival required. He had a choice to make, and the choice would define whether he lived as a man who had followed orders into catastrophe or died as a man who had defied orders to prevent one. June 21, 1941, 11 p.m., Moscow, Commissariat of the Navy. Nikolai Kuznetsov sat alone at his desk, staring at the telephone that connected him to fleet headquarters across 3 seas. The office was silent except for the ticking of the clock on his wall, a sound that had never seemed so loud or so urgent. The smell of cold tea and cigarette ash hung in the air. Through his window, the pale summer twilight painted Moscow in shades of gray that matched the uncertainty pressing against his chest. The directive from the Defense Commissariat had arrived 20 minutes earlier. He had read it 3 times, searching for authorization that was not there. Border districts were to occupy firing positions in fortified zones. Aircraft were to be dispersed and camouflaged before dawn. Troops were not to respond to provocations that might be designed to trigger conflict. The language was careful, bureaucratic, designed to provide cover for whatever happened next, rather than to prevent what was about to happen. The directive said nothing specific about naval forces. It provided no explicit authority for the measures that Kuznetsov knew his fleets required. He understood what the silence meant. The Navy had been forgotten in the panic of the final hours, overlooked by men whose attention was fixed on the land frontier, where 3 million German soldiers were waiting for the order to advance. No one had thought about the ships in Sevastopol harbor, or the submarines at Kronstadt, or the destroyers patrolling the Arctic approaches. No one had authorized combat readiness for forces that would be attacked as certainly as the border garrisons. Kuznetsov picked up the telephone and asked the operator to connect him to the Baltic Fleet headquarters in Tallinn. The connection took 4 minutes, 4 minutes during which he could have changed his mind, could have decided that following the ambiguous directive was safer than exceeding it. He did not change his mind. Admiral Vladimir Tributes answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the particular alertness of a commander who had not been sleeping. Kuznetsov gave the order, Combat Readiness Number 1, full wartime alert, all ships to battle stations, ammunition to be distributed from depots to magazines, shore leave cancelled, aircraft to be armed and dispersed. The order exceeded anything the Defense Commissariat directive authorized. It exceeded anything Kuznetsov had explicit permission to command. It was, in the strict interpretation of Soviet military law, an act of insubordination that could be characterized as provocation, panic, or treason, depending on how the next 24 hours unfolded. He made the same call to the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. Admiral Filipp Golikov received the order and began implementation without questions that the telephone line made impossible to answer safely. He made the call to the Northern Fleet headquarters in Polyarny. Admiral Arseny Golikov acknowledged and complied. By midnight, the orders were propagating through the Soviet naval command structure, reaching ships and bases and installations across 11 time zones. Sailors who had been sleeping in their bunks were shaken awake by petty officers who could not explain why. Men stumbled through passageways that smelled of diesel fuel and salt, taking positions at guns they had trained on but never fired in combat. Ammunition handlers broke seals on magazines that had been locked since the last exercise. Radio operators tuned to frequencies reserved for wartime communication. The fleets were coming alive, transforming from peacetime organizations into instruments of war without knowing what war they were preparing to fight. Kuznetsov remained at his desk through the hours that followed, monitoring reports from fleet commanders who confirmed implementation while asking questions he could not answer. When would the attack come? What were the German objectives? What rules of engagement should govern the response? He told them what he knew, which was almost nothing, and what he believed, which was that dawn would bring attacks that only readiness could survive. The clock on his wall showed 2:47 a.m. when the first reports arrived from the Black Sea Fleet. Unidentified aircraft were approaching Sevastopol. The anti-aircraft batteries were manned, the ships were at stations, the ammunition was loaded. Whatever happened next, the Soviet Navy would not be caught sleeping at its moorings, destroyed before it could fight. Kuznetsov lit a cigarette and waited to learn whether his decision would make him a hero or a corpse. June 22, 1941, 3:15 a.m. The German artillery opened fire along an 1,800-kilometer front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The sound reached Soviet border posts as a continuous rumble that soldiers initially mistook for thunder, for summer storms rolling across the frontier, for anything other than what it actually was. Within minutes, the shells began falling on barracks, ammunition depots, communication centers, and airfields where aircraft sat in the neat rows that regulations required and survival prohibited. The largest military operation in human history had begun, and the warnings that 84 separate intelligence reports had provided were proven accurate in the worst possible way. The Luftwaffe crossed into Soviet airspace at 3:30 a.m., over 2,000 aircraft flying toward targets that German reconnaissance had photographed so thoroughly that pilots navigated by landmark recognition rather than instruments. They found exactly what the photographs had promised: Soviet planes parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields whose anti-aircraft defenses were unmanned or manned by crews who had received no authorization to fire. The bombs fell on aircraft that never left the ground, on fuel depots that erupted into fireballs visible for kilometers, on hangars whose contents burned with the particular intensity of aviation gasoline meeting high explosive. By noon on the first day, the Soviet Air Force had lost approximately 1,200 aircraft. The number was so catastrophic that the officer who compiled the initial report hesitated to submit it, fearing accuracy would be interpreted as defeatism. Most of the destroyed planes had never taken off. Their pilots had died in quarters adjacent to airfields or had survived to watch their machines burn from distances that permitted observation but not intervention. The air cover that Soviet ground forces needed to survive the German onslaught had been eliminated before the ground battle properly began. The Soviet Navy told a different story. At Sevastopol, German aircraft approached the harbor at 3:13 a.m. and encountered anti-aircraft fire that the pilots had not expected. Ships were at battle stations, guns were manned, ammunition was loaded and ready. The attack damaged port facilities but sank no major vessels. The Black Sea Fleet survived the opening hours intact, its combat power preserved by an order that Kuznetsov had issued without authorization and against the implicit prohibition of directives that prioritized avoiding provocation over preparing for war. The same pattern repeated at Kronstadt, at Tallinn, at every naval installation where Kuznetsov's Combat Readiness No. 1 order had arrived in time for implementation. German planners had expected to catch the Soviet fleet as unprepared as the Soviet Air Force, had allocated Luftwaffe resources to port attacks that would eliminate naval threats before they materialized. The resources were wasted. The ships they targeted were shooting back. The fleet that should have been destroyed in the first hours remained operational, a strategic asset that would matter increasingly as the war continued. Kuznetsov received confirmation of his fleet's survival through reports that arrived at the Navy Commissariat throughout the morning. Each message brought relief that mixed with the horror of what was happening elsewhere, on frontiers where armies were dissolving under attacks they had been forbidden to prepare for. He had saved his ships. He could not save the soldiers dying in border fortifications that had never been properly manned, or the pilots burning in aircraft that had never been properly dispersed, or the civils in cities whose air defense systems had never been properly activated. Stalin received the news of the invasion at his dacha outside Moscow, where he had retreated after the late-night Kremlin meeting. The accounts of his reaction varied depending on who provided them and when. Some witnesses described shock, a man confronting the collapse of assumptions he had defended against all evidence. Others described denial, continued insistence that the attacks must be provocations rather than the full-scale invasion that reports increasingly confirmed. What all accounts agreed upon was paralysis. The man whose approval was required for any significant Soviet response was incapable of providing that approval in the hours when response mattered most. Directive No. 2, authorizing Soviet forces to attack German territory, was not issued until 7:15 a.m., nearly 4 hours after the invasion began. By then, the German advance had penetrated kilometers into Soviet territory. By then, the aircraft that might have struck German columns were burning wreckage. By then, the communication systems that might have coordinated counterattacks had been severed by German special operations units who had crossed the border in the pre-dawn darkness. The directive authorized actions that were no longer possible, commanding responses that the shattered remnants of border forces could not execute. Stalin withdrew from command decisions for nearly 2 weeks following the invasion. He retreated to his dacha and did not emerge, convinced at various points that his colleagues would arrest him, that the war was already lost, that the framework he had constructed to understand the world had failed so completely that no new framework could replace it. The warnings he had dismissed were accurate. The invasion he had denied was real. The catastrophe he had enabled was unfolding across a front that stretched further than any human mind could comprehend. Richard Sorge learned that his warnings had been correct from a Tokyo prison cell. Japanese police had arrested him on October 18, 1941, 4 months after the invasion he had predicted with such precision. The arrest followed the exposure of his radio operator, Max Clausen, whose transmission patterns had attracted the attention of Japanese counterintelligence. Sorge was interrogated for months in facilities that smelled of disinfectant, sweat, and the particular desperation of men who know that their secrets are being extracted one question at a time. He confessed to espionage. He named members of his network. He provided details of operations that had delivered intelligence to Moscow for nearly a decade. The Soviet government denied any connection to him. When Japanese authorities inquired through diplomatic channels about exchanging Sorge for Japanese prisoners, Moscow responded that the man was unknown to them, that claims of his Soviet affiliation were fabrications. The denial was consistent with standard intelligence practice. It was also a death sentence. Sorge was tried, convicted, and hanged at Sugamo prison on November 7, 1944, the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution he had served since his conversion to communism in the wreckage of the First World War. He was 49 years old. He died without knowing whether his warnings had reached Stalin, without knowing that they had reached Stalin and been dismissed, without knowing that the accuracy he had achieved had meant nothing against the certainty that Stalin had already constructed. Filipp Golikov's career did not suffer from the intelligence failures of June 1941. The man who had annotated warnings as doubtful, who had filtered evidence through the membrane of political safety, who had ensured that truth reached Stalin's desk only in forms that could be ignored, was promoted rather than punished. He commanded armies at Stalingrad, received decorations for military service that had nothing to do with the intelligence work that had preceded the war. He rose to the rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union, the highest military grade the nation could bestow. He died on July 29, 1980, at the age of 79, in a Moscow that had long since stopped asking questions about who knew what before the invasion and why the knowledge had not mattered. The system that had produced Golikov's behavior survived as well. Soviet intelligence never acknowledged the failure of June 1941 in terms that assigned responsibility to specific individuals or institutional practices. The catastrophe was attributed to German surprise, to the perfidy of fascist aggression, to factors that absolved everyone and explained nothing. The lesson that intelligence services existed to tell leaders what they needed to hear, not what they wanted to hear, was never formally incorporated into Soviet doctrine. The pattern repeated itself in different forms across the decades that followed. Nikolai Kuznetsov survived the war as the admiral who had saved the Soviet fleet, the commander whose unauthorized order had preserved naval power that contributed to eventual victory. His reward was characteristic of the system he served. Stalin, whose paralysis in June 1941 had enabled catastrophe, could not tolerate subordinates whose initiative highlighted his own failure. Kuznetsov was demoted in 1947, accused of sharing naval secrets with Allied forces during the wartime cooperation that Stalin himself had authorized. He was reduced in rank, stripped of awards, assigned to minor positions that removed him from meaningful command. Stalin's death in 1953 brought rehabilitation. Kuznetsov was restored to the rank of Admiral of the Soviet Union of the Navy, the highest naval grade the nation possessed. He served as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy until 1956, when political conflicts with Khrushchev led to a second demotion. He spent his final years writing memoirs that described the June night when he had chosen action over safety, when he had decided that saving ships mattered more than following procedures designed to protect careers rather than fleets. He died on December 6, 1974, in a Soviet Union that had named an aircraft carrier after him, an honor that acknowledged what he had done while the system that had punished him remained unchanged. The man who told the truth was hanged by enemies. The man who distorted the truth became a marshal. The man who acted without authorization was demoted by allies. These outcomes revealed something about the systems that produced them, something that numbers and dates and intelligence reports could not capture. Stalin had received the warnings. Stalin had refused to believe them. The refusal was not stupidity. It was the logical consequence of a system that punished accuracy and rewarded conformity, that killed messengers and promoted survivors, that made truth dangerous and lies safe. 4 million Soviet soldiers died in 1941. They died because the man who could have prepared for war had constructed a world in which preparation was impossible and warning was treason.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com